This video is sponsored by Ironweld, a holistic wargaming event happening May 25th and 26th in Lynnfield, Massachusetts. More about that later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is a Warhammer 40k tournament tech talk. In my last Tech Talk video, we talked about a bunch of lists that did well over the course of a weekend from Space Wolves, and today we're going to do a similar thing because we had several lists this past weekend go well with Tyranids. First off, it's Tyranids, so I'm of course going to cover it because they're my favorite boys, but also they're a relatively underperforming faction, and so having two lists go 5-0, especially lists that, as we'll talk about a little bit later, are relatively similar in composition, is pretty interesting. So what we're going to do today, as always in these Tech Talk videos, is talk about the lists in particular, the events that they did well at, and the opponents that they played. Because we have two lists to cover today, we're not going to go too in-depth with the opponent's armies, but what we will do is talk about as much of the matchup as we can. And I'll pick out some important things about the opponent's list that may have skewed it in the Tyranids' favor in each case. As always, if you enjoy my Tech Talk videos and my Warhammer 40k coverage, please drop a like in the video, subscribe on the channel. All that YouTube stuff, you know the drill, you know what's going on. I've said it a lot before, and it's the same in this video. And let's talk about Ironweld. Let me get my crystal ball and call me a psychic, because I'm about to make a bold prediction here. Which is that if you're watching this video about Warhammer tournaments, you probably enjoy miniature gaming tournaments yourself. And if you're looking for one to go to in the next couple months, oh boy, have I got news for you. Because this video is sponsored by Ironweld, a new event run by the folks over at Wicked Dicey. Ironweld is going to be a cross-denominational miniature gaming extravaganza run on the weekend of May 27th and 28th. It'll have events and seminars for games of all types, including Star Wars Legion, MCP, Conquest, Battletech, Malifaux, and many more. But of course, the headliners are GT level events for both Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar. The Wicked Dicey crew put on Everwinter this past December, an event for which I streamed most of the 40k GT, so I can say with experience that the crew puts on some incredible shows, and Ironweld promises to be even bigger and better. This convention is even being held near my neck of the woods in Wakefield, Massachusetts. There's awesome access, good parking for folks who are driving in, and a lot of awesome local activities. So clear out the weekend of May 27th and 28th and check out wickeddicey.com/Ironweld to get your ticket today. Now, the first thing we're going to do in this video is talk about some of the core mechanics behind the lists that we're going to discuss. Since I mentioned before, they are a similar composition, so they have a lot of overlapping rules. And that is because both of them use the same sub-faction and a lot of similar units. And that sub-faction being Hive Fleet Gorgon. Now, Gorgon's a little bit of an oddity in the Tyranid faction. Since a lot of these sub-factions that relied on more heavy infantry and monster-heavy builds got serious nerfs in the last data slate this past January, Hive Fleet Gorgon has sort of remained as one of the alternative ways that Tyranids could still compete. Since units like Hormagaunts remained relatively competitive in the faction, players started looking at ways to make them more impactful, and Hive Fleet Gorgon's one of the best ways to do that. The big reason for that is their sub-faction ability that gives them a 4+ poison against non-vehicle units. So as long as you hit something that isn't made out of metal, you can automatically wound it on a 4+. That is excellent, especially in a meta where you're worried about hitting heavy infantry or big, huge monsters. Gorgon tends to be the mirror breaker for Tyranids, for example. They're extremely good against enemies running lots of Tyranid warriors at toughness 5 or tons of the big monsters, since even little Tyranids or high volume shooting will wound the entire faction on a 4+. Similarly, they're really good against Chaos Demons, and Chaos Demons being pretty strong right now is certainly a reason that Hive Fleet Gorgon would see some extra play. Greater Demons evaporate to this faction. They tend to have relatively middling or low armor penetration characteristics because they're focused on low strength weapons, which tend to not be good at penetrating armor, which obviously doesn't matter in the demon matchup because demons don't wear armor. So all of those little tiny attacks are going to be basically the same as a big attack against any demon unit. And when your entire army becomes like minimum strength 8 against greater demons, they die pretty quickly. Now, the other benefit here, and especially against demons, is that the other way to get around their demonic invulnerability, in addition to high volume attacks that wound on pretty good wound rolls, is also just mortal wounds, and Hive Fleet Gorgon has those in spades as as well with its psychic power. The Gorgon psychic power gives you effectively a sniper rule in melee. Your 6s to hit deal mortal wounds on top of normal damage. Now, for a sub-faction that's already prioritizing taking a high volume of attacks, being able to pile 6 mortal wounds on top of whatever your damage you're doing is pretty important. And the psychic power is doubly important because unlike the poison sub-faction ability, it works against vehicles. Your small units like Hormagaunts are not going to be that effective at hitting a heavily armored unit. They can still put 6 damage into it almost automatically just by rolling 6s to wound, and then also force on top of that, force some number of AP1 hits on the target. Now, I've talked about Hormagaunts quite a bit. They synergize with all of the Gorgon special abilities, and because Hormagaunts themselves have some built-in support from the faction, especially given the fact that they themselves have a unique stratagem that can be used on the unit that gives them the ability to advance and charge and an automatic 6-inch on their advance roll. For 1 CP, they're good at delivering themselves. They don't really need much help in that category. So the fact that Gorgon synergizes well with these light infantry units also makes it very good at playing primary. You're going to play a ton of little tiny flighty units that are objective secured. You're going to run them very quickly onto your opponent's side of the table and try to blow up their units with mortal wounds and poison damage. In doing so, you're going to be able to knock down their primary objective score, give your own self a buff on primary objective score, and this can also be compounded by the type of biomorphologies that Gorgon has access to. Now, every Tyranid subfaction gets a normal subfaction ability and then an adaptive subfaction ability that when you're building your list, you can switch out for a selection of alternative. Generally speaking, the best list in these are the lurk biomorphologies. This is because they have access to 2 specific subfaction abilities, those being naturalized camouflage and territorial instincts, which are incredibly powerful. The balancing factor, and I think an interesting part of the design of the Tyranid faction, is that the more generically powerful Tyranid subfactions like High Fleet Leviathan do not have access to lurk biomorphologies. So while their natural subfaction abilities are a little bit stronger, they don't get access to the powerful adaptive traits. And honestly, the lurk biomorphology abilities, especially that naturalized camouflage and that territorial instincts, are both so good that there isn't really a great argument for which one or the other. It just depends on the style of list that you're playing and what you value in your game plan. And as we'll see, both of them are pretty effective in conjunction with the High Fleet Gorgon build. So now you have a little bit of a primer on High Fleet Gorgon itself. Let's talk about some lists that did well using it. And the first one we're going to talk about today is from GT Logrono. This was a 30-player GT held in Spain. Now, there was some weirdness with this GT. Player in question that we're going to be talking about today, Paradox, was actually the TO of the event. Now, I don't think there's a real problem with that inherently, but I do think it is worth disclosing. In addition, there was some stat padding in there. There were a couple players that were registered and registered as playing all their games, but then put in as all losses with 0 score, which I don't think makes a huge difference. It just changes slightly how ITC points are scored. ITC points are generally weighted on the number of players at the event. A total addition to the score of having 2 extra players on the roster doesn't really make much of a difference, but I do think, again, it's worth talking about. Anyway, let's talk about the list itself and less about weird ITC chicanery. This list, like I said before, is running High Fleet Gorgon and running the Territorial Instincts subfaction ability. This gives all of the monsters in the list objective secured, and if they are 10 wounds or above, which they all are, they also count as 5 models when holding an objective. The list itself was led by a pair of Hive Tyrants, a standard Hive Tyrant running the Shard Gullet Relic Venom Cannon alongside Heightened Senses to give it rerolls on its hit rolls. That's a big downside of the Shard Gullet Cannon. It is pretty good at shooting, but unfortunately, especially outside of High Fleet Leviathan, you don't have any rerolls built in, which means that it's incredibly inconsistent. And having rerolls to hit just means that any of those 1s or maybe 2s to hit if you're shooting through dense cover are then going to be able to be rerolled into a conversion. It also means that if the Tyrant gets bracketed, then it can potentially melee just as well as it would normally. Normally it hits on 2s and rerolls 1s with its Bone Sword, but if it's bracketed, it may be hitting on 3s. A Neurothrope was also in the list with the Resonance Barb to cast powers at that +1, mostly support powers like Catalyst, Onslaught, and the Gorgon-specific power. And then the Swarmlord was in there. The Swarmlord was the Warlord, interestingly enough. That usually means that you're going to play the Hive Tyrant a little bit more aggressively, but I do like Swarmlord running across the table with Reckless Abandon if your other Hive Tyrant is your Warlord. Swarmlord is incredibly powerful in lists like this because he has the ability to add a Chapter Master effect through the Synaptic Link to core units, which means he can give any of the Hormagaunts units that we're about to be talking about full rerolls to hit. Now, Hormagaunts have a ton of attacks, and they are relatively cheap per model, but they only have a weapon skill of 4+. But having full rerolls in there certainly helps. And it basically means that you don't necessarily need to include direct guidance in your list, although it certainly helps as well on top of Swarmlord's rerolls if you want to convert those Hormagaunts in a consistent way. In the troop slot, we had 10 Gargoyles for some objective holding. They are fast infantry, so they're good for actions and utility purposes, alongside 3 units of Hormagaunts with Toxin Sacks. Now, Toxin Sacks do increase the cost of the units, but not too much. We're only paying 1 point per model for them for that Gene Rot Might effect on all their attacks. But because those Hormagaunts are only 15 models, their Bounding Advance stratagem only costs 1 CP instead of 2, which is the most efficient size of Hormagaunt unit that you can bring. We then have 2 units of Pyrovores, a unit of 3 and a unit of 2. These guys have insane flamers, either an 18-inch range 2d6 flamer profile or a 12-inch range AP2 2 damage profile. And again, all of the attacks made by models in the subfaction are poison, not just melee attacks, which means all of these guns are also benefiting from that faction ability. Now, it's not going to work on vehicles, so they don't become good at killing tanks, but if the heavy armor tends to be heavier infantry or monsters, Pyrovores melt them insanely quickly. Pyrovores are also just kind of annoying to kill. They're 5 wounds each for 40 points and have a 3+ armor save, so sometimes they just randomly don't die, especially with that 5 wound characteristic. It takes them a little bit longer than you'd expect to kill, because you'd usually need 2 d6 damage shots to convert to kill one, and you need 3 2 damage shots to go through 100% of the time. We then had a unit of Venom Thropes in the list to provide -1 to hit and a fight last effect, a Parasite of Mortrax upgraded with Alien Cunning to allow it to advance and perform actions, and give it 5 model objectives secured. This is incredibly strong on a character like the Parasite of Mortrax because they are a base move of 16 with Fly, meaning that the Parasite itself is going to be able to run around and drop banners around the table in important places, or just use it to shore up a primary objective control. Again, these lists are incredibly strong at scoring primary objective. They are so good at it, I cannot stress enough. Last but certainly not least, we then have 2 Tyranofexes, both of these upgraded with acid sprays to give them an 18-inch range flamer equivalent profile, d6 plus 6 shots at strength 6, a high AP, and a flat 2 damage. And again, with that poison profile alongside an 8-shot stinger salvo, these Tyranofexes can put a ding on vehicles, so they need 5s to wound, which is a little bit awkward, but they can also rip apart monsters or infantry units. One of the Tyranofexes is upgraded with Voracious Ammunition to do D3 mortal wounds after it hits something with a ranged attack, and the other with Dermic Symbiosis to give it a 4+ invulnerable save. I don't know if I mentioned already, but we also have a unit of Tyrant Guard in the list, equipped with Bone Cleavers to protect the 2 Hive Tyrant. The Tyrant Guard will bodyguard for them, keep themselves out of line of sight or in cover in a very defensible position, and make it very difficult for the opponent to deal with the Hive Tyrants before they're able to make back their points or deliver themselves into melee. Now, overall, this is a pretty good core for what we can expect out of a Hive Fleet Gorgon list. The Swarmlord in particular is an incredibly important include because, again, the weapon skill characteristic of those Hormagaunts is absolutely terrible, and having a full reroll on them is also awesome. The Swarmlord also has a less impactful effect to give core units objectives secured that is very useful on the smaller 3-model units like Tyrant Guard or Pyrovores. You'll often find yourself in a situation where the Hormagaunts have killed the opponent's objective secured, but they're outnumbering you with raw models, and being able to target your own guys with a targetable objective secured certainly helps in the command phase. In addition, it also, if you're already objective secured, counts you as double models, meaning that the Gargoyles or Hormagaunts can then count as 20 to 30 models when holding objectives. So even if your opponent is stocked full of objective secured models, you can steal objectives away from them. Now, speaking of those matchups, let's talk about what Paradox played with this list. Round 1 was against Drukhari. This was an interesting Drukhari build that took a lot of Talos and Grotesques. Now, those are monsters and heavy infantry, and again, those are perfect targets for this Hive Fleet Gorgon poison to hit. Drukhari tend to have low armor save characteristics, which means those flamers from the Pyrovores and the melee attacks from the Hormagaunts deal insane damage to their units. And I find it hard to believe that Drukhari would beat a Hive Fleet Gorgon list in a straight up trade. So I'm not too surprised that we got out of that round just fine. Round 2 was against Space Wolves. Now, I think Space Wolves could potentially be a problem for a list like this if they were running these more spammy lists that were focusing on small units of 5 Skyclaws or Wolfguard, since those units will basically trade 1-for-1 with any of these Hormagaunt units or even Pyrovores that they come in touch with. Instead, this list was bringing triple Wolfen and triple Wolfguard, just a bunch of melee stuff. And again, those are relatively heavy infantry, and I think they get ripped apart by the poison effect on all of these attacks. attacks. The trend kind of continues in round 3, where we played against Emperor's Chosen Adeptus Custodes. Now, unlike a lot of Adeptus Custodes lists, this one took 12 bikers. Virtus Praetors you usually see in units of 3, but they can be taken up to units of 6, and this list elected to take 3 units of 4. Now, the bikers are toughness 6, high wound count models, but they are extremely expensive per wound, and they only have a 2+ save. I say only a 2+ save because any Presidium Shield Adeptus Custodes can really shrug off a lot of the incoming damage from lists like this Tyranid list, since a lot of it's only AP 1, and those Presidium Shields are still going to be saving on 2s. The Bikers, on the other hand, go from a 2+ to a 3+ save, so you have literally doubled the amount of damage you do with just 1 point of AP against them. And the fact that they're Bikers, not vehicles, means that the entire army wounds them on 4s, despite the fact that they're toughness 6. Again, I'm not really that surprised that we were able to get through. A Hormigate unit isn't going to kill 4 Custodes Bikers in one swing, but they will certainly trade up quite a bit. Round 4 was against Leagues of Votann. Now, this was a relatively vehicle-heavy build of Votann, and I was a little bit worried for the Tyranid. It was double land fortresses, but it eschewed a lot of the super important units in the Votann army, specifically things like Hernkin Pioneers. Instead, this list in particular took 40 Hearthkin Warriors. I imagine what happened to this particular matchup was that the Hearthkin Warriors were murdered mercilessly by the Hormigans and left only the land fortresses around. The land fortresses can probably table the Tyranid player, but not before the Tyranid player beats them on primary. Round 5 was Votann again. This time, we had triple Hernkin Pioneers, which I think, again, is a lot more dangerous of a build, but only 1 land fortress, so only 1 big vehicle to deal with. The Hernkin Pioneers have a little bit of a similar problem to the Custodes Bikers, however. They are not vehicle keyworded, and generally speaking, they provide the majority of the objectives secured for the Votann army. So if the Votann player plays them too aggressively or isn't able to escape from the Hormigans from hitting them, the Hormigans can come in, neutralize one of those units, steal the objectives away from them, and at that point, the Votann player has very little recourse, especially with the Swarm Lord granting objectives secured to other infantry and running them onto the Votann objectives. With just a couple of guns remaining on their side of the table, even if they kill the majority of the Tyranid army, they're probably not going to be winning on the primary. And with that, that was Paradox at 5-0 for the GT Logrono. Now, I don't know any more information about this event. I don't know what the terrain was on or if there were any particular house rules that were used in this situation, but I do know a little bit more about the next event that we're going to talk about. This one was the Fool's Errand GT in Calgary, Alberta. Now, this event used player-placed terrain. I'm going to have a video about different terrain formats later on in this week, and I will talk, I promise, about Canadian player-placed terrain because I think it is very important. Typically, player-placed terrain has a very good record for armies like this Tyranid army that has good threat ranges, maybe not like the best threat ranges in the game. They're no longer double moving and moving 40 inches and then charging, but they do have a 16-inch move, so somewhere around 20 to 23 inches is where you should reasonably expecting them to be charging. And player-placed terrain is extremely good for that because not only can you create line of sight blockers in your deployment zone, you can also stage line of sight blocking terrain at a position where the Tyranid player can use that to threaten the majority of the opponent's objectives or even their home objectives. And we've seen interactions like this occur in many other player-placed terrain events. We know that Blood Angels typically have a pretty good record on events using this style of terrain, and Blood Angels with a very similar style of play where they're going to be trying to stage units like Sanguinary Guard, you know, between 20 to 22 inches away from their opponent's side of the table. Also took down Las Vegas Open when Jack Harpster won it in this past January using player-placed terrain. So I do think that armies of this style and player-placed terrain tend to mesh pretty well. Now, the list that Ozzie took is an extremely similar build of Hive Fleet Gorgon. We're going to see a lot of overlap between the two styles of list here, although there are some key differences. And the first one being the selection of adaptive trait. This list brought the naturalized camouflage adaptive trait, giving all of the infantry in the list an additional bonus to their armor save if they are in light cover. Now, the power level of this particular subfaction ability has varied wildly as the meta shifts, because oftentimes you'll run into a situation where some factions will take abilities to ignore cover in great numbers. For example, Leagues of Votann have a ton of units that ignore light cover, including Hernkin Pioneers and Hecaton Land Fortresses, and if we had seen Paradox take this naturalized camouflage instead of his territorial instincts in the games that he played, I think there's a non-zero chance that he would not have gone 5-0. But right now we're in a situation where light cover is extremely powerful, because we see a lot of non-Imperial Space Marines and a lot of Astra Militarum, as well as Yuriani not taking the expert shots sub-faction ability. Now, this importantly has one other impact in the meta, and that is currently against Astra Militarum. Astra Militarum are probably the best gun line in 40k, I think. It's not really even close. However, they don't ignore cover for most of the time. Sometimes they'll have a veteran guerrillas unit that will, but most often they're going to be taking born soldiers to power the Khazarkan combo, and only one unit will actually ignore light cover. Especially given the fact that a lot of their damage is dealt indirectly from mortar teams, having that naturalized camouflage able to stack with the indirect fire armor save bonus that you'll be getting, where if your opponent doesn't see you, they're going to add an additional +1 to your save, can give you effectively +3 to your armor save, which means that 5+ save models like Hormagaunts go down to a 2+ save. If your save is better than that, like Pyrovores or Venomthropes, you are almost immune to the mortar fire, which is a pretty big deal. Now, what exactly did the list take to take advantage of this? It starts with 2 Hive Tyrants. Unlike the last list we talked about, neither of them is the Swarm Lord, so unfortunately his synergy with Hormagaunts is not present. But we are taking a lot of shooting to compensate for that. One of the Hive Tyrants is running Shard Gullet alongside Adaptive Biology to give it a 5+ damage ignore. Shard Gullet is randomly an assault weapon, so giving yourself a little bit of more resilience allows you to play a little bit more aggressively with that Hive Tyrant. You can run him up the table, you can advance him around and take shots with him, and even if your opponent gets a couple hits back, he's probably not going to go down. The second Hive Tyrant is running Direct Guidance to give the Hormagaunts +1 to hit. So even if they are not getting the full rerolls from the Swarm Lord, they can still be hitting on 3s and rerolling 1s, which is gonna be relatively equivalent. This one is running the Bale Thorn Cannon, a Relic Strangle Thorn Cannon that comes in at D3 +3 shots for 3 flat damage, which is a pretty good profile. We have a Neurothrope as well to cast our support powers, and interestingly, a Tyranid Prime. This guy helps out the Hormagaunts as well by giving them reroll 1s to wound on their attacks. He can also buff their charges a little bit by shooting something with his Venom Cannon. It's similar to the Hive Tyrants, but the Hive Tyrants will usually be trying to kill whatever they're shooting at. And the Tyranid Prime has just a 36-inch range 2 damage gun. If he hits with his attack, then you can apply Shard Lure for an additional D6 and drop the lowest on charges against that target. He's a very good applicator for that particular strategy. Speaking of Hormagaunts, we only have 2 units in this list, but they are the max big units of 15, alongside 3 units of 3 Pyrovores. We're all in on the Pyrovore train today, and 2 units of Venomthropes. The Venomthropes each broadcast a 3-inch aura that potentially forces one enemy unit within it to fight last at the start of each fight phase. It is on a roll of a 3+, so having that redundancy can sort of spread that effect around. Venomthropes are already 2+ poison though, so they don't really have that much additional synergy with High Fleet Gorgon. But they also have a high volume of attack, so they are pretty good at dealing mortal wounds with the psychic power. We then have 3 Ripper Swarms in the fast attack slot. I think these guys are mostly just here because they're a cheap unit that holds objectives. Not much else to say there. Alongside 2 Tyrannofexes. Now, what is fascinating about these lists is how similar they are and different in very meaningful ways. Obviously, they're both running double Hive Tyrant, protected by Tyrant Guard, 2+ units of Hormagaunts, Pyrovores, Venomthropes in the elite slot, and 2 Tyrannofexes in the heavy support slot, but both of the Tyrannofexes are kitted out differently. These Tyrannofexes are running Flesh Borer Hives, a relatively long-range, high-volume, real crap AP and damage weapon that is extremely good at infantry sweeping at range, but much worse against heavy armor. Now, obviously, if you're not running into heavy armored vehicles, those Flesh Borer Hives will rip apart anything else, since you're wounding any non-vehicle on, at worst, a 4+, so you're going to be inflicting a ton of damage on them. That's in addition to the Stinger Salvo that the Tyrannofexes already have. One of these Tyrannofexes is running Dermic Symbiosis for the 4+ invulnerable save. The other one is unupgraded. Now, importantly as well, these models are not objective secured, so I think the difference between these 2 players is that Ozzie's probably looking to use his Tyrannofexes as a little bit more of a long-range fire base, whereas on the flip side, Paradox's Tyrannofexes probably push much farther forward. They only have an 18-inch range gun, but they are OBSEC, which means they are very good at shooting over the middle of the table. Now, what armies did Ozzie play against? In round 1, he was up against Undivided Demons, running a bunch of units from different subfactions, but importantly ran 9 Beasts of Nurgle. These are high toughness units that regenerate if you don't kill them in a single phase, but fortunately are high toughness, but not vehicles, which means that a Gorgon army rips them to shreds. Not surprising we got out of that one. To be honest, I feel bad for the demon player because that is an unfortunate matchup. Now, we got demons again in round 2, but this is a little bit more reasonable. This is Slanesh demons, and these are only toughness 3, so the poison effect doesn't work so well, but fortunately for the Tyranids, they are going to be taking a lot of high volume attacks anyway, so they are naturally good at infantry sweeping. Since you're running 45 attacks from your Hormigant units, you have tons and tons of flamers on all of the pyrovores, and on top of that, you can also do mortal wounds on top of that normal damage, which is good at punching through demonic invulnerability. You're just very good at killing these medium toughness, high wound count or high model count units. Round 3 is a little bit tougher. We're against Ulthwé Eldari Aspect Spam. This ran a ton of different Aspect Warriors, including Howling Banshee, Striking Scorpions, and Warp Spiders. That's a little bit dangerous for Tyranids, especially since that high volume, sort of middling strength and AP attacks are very good at killing the kind of medium armor units that Tyranids are taking a lot of time. But again, that naturalized camouflage comes in clutch there, especially with units like Pyrovores going down to a 1+ armor save, which, unless they rend, a lot of the Eldari units can't get through. Especially with those 2 Tyrannifexes sitting at the back of the table, any Eldari unit that pokes its head out gets rinsed. So they have to really convert super highly in order to get out of that matchup. Now, round 4 is the interesting one to me because this list was up against the bugbear of the meta right now, Astra Militarum. Now, this is a pretty standard Astra Militarum list with a little bit of spice in it. It was running triple mortar teams and 3 Leman Russ, which is, to be fair, a little bit less than normal. Those Leman Russ don't really like to fight against the Hive Tyrants, though. The Balethorn Cannon and Shard Gullet probably account for a single dead Leman Russ every turn. You do have to worry about the Khazarkin, but the Khazarkin can be killed or engaged by Hormigants running across the table at them. And if those Hormigants or Pyrovores get to grips or get line of sight to a Khazarkin unit, it's going to be ripped apart. Again, also, we do have those 2 Fleshboar Hives sitting in the back of the table as well. And those guys are also going to be able to knock down some Khazarkin units if they show their ugly face. Interestingly, the Astra Militarum list did run 3 units of Tempestus Scions, I think mostly for secondary objective play. It's and some Bulgrins. There's Bulgrins in this list too. It was wild. The Bulgrins can be a little bit annoying when dealing with the Khazarkin because they can protect the Khazarkin with Wall of Muscle. Definitely goes to show that it looks like maybe the naturalized camouflage technology is working, where the mortar teams weren't able to rinse down a lot of the army in the early game. And especially if it was able to kill the Leman Russes with impunity with the 2 Hive Tyrants, the rest of the list is very good at killing Astra Militarum bodies, so maybe that's the answer. Last, but certainly not least, was the final round against Custodes. This one is a little bit more of a heavily armored Custodes build, running 3 Contemptors as well as 4 units of Sagittarum. The Sagittarum are scary, but the Contempt, they do reduce damage by 1, which doesn't matter so much when you have low volume, high damage attacks coming. And on an unfortunate roll for the Custodes, either one of those Hive Tyrants can account for an entire dead Contemptor in one go. For armies with this like sort of middling level of armor, I think the Hive Tyrants are incredibly strong. It's when you run into armies like Imperial or Chaos Knights that things get a little bit more awkward, where you start to be unable to do enough damage to them in the shooting phase to stop them from running at you, and you're basically useless against them in the fight phase beyond just pinging them for a couple damage. That's the matchup I would be worried about in here, but we didn't hit it. Instead, just a couple Dreadnoughts and a bunch of Sagittarum. The Sagittarum, again, go down pretty quickly, not having a Storm Shield, to the Hormigants and the Fleshboar Hives, and that allows the Hive Tyrants to knock down the armor and take the Tyranids to victory. And with that, that was Ozzie Meloche taking down the Fool's Errand GT. So interesting to see the Tyranids are basically pivoting into high fleet Gorgon builds. And I think the fact it gives you just enough tools in the toolbox to deal with a wide variety of armies means that you're good at primary objective and you can do with lists that aren't particular skews in any one direction. Obviously, if you skew into being a horde or having monsters or something, Gorgon's just going to kill you. But I think that vehicle spam is always the reason that I'm a little bit wary of playing high fleet Gorgon myself. Any of these lists basically just lose immediately to Knights. Who knows? I'm not the one playing high fleet Gorgon, so maybe it does work. Congratulations to both these players, however, for going 5-0. That's awesome with a faction that's not doing so hot, and it's nice to see some people repping the Tyranids even at this stage. Let me know down in the comments what you think about High Fleet Gorgon in particular and this list as well. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to Ironweld for sponsoring this video. I really appreciate their support, and I hope you come hang out with me at the end of May at their event. I'm going to be streaming it, by the way, so if you want to watch as well, you can hang out on this channel, and I'll also be there, so that'll be sweet. Everyone who supports the channel as well is awesome, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.